The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the cramped training hall as two legends faced each other across worn wooden floors that had witnessed countless battles. It was March 15th, 1994, and the air in Hong Kong's Central District crackled with an electricity that had nothing to do with the ancient wiring. Jackie Chan, already a household name with his death-defying stunts and infectious grin, stood motionless for perhaps the first time in his adult life. Across from him, Ip Man's weathered hands moved with the fluid precision of water flowing around stone, his eyes holding secrets that had shaped the very foundations of martial arts cinema. What happened in those 22 minutes would challenge everything the world thought it knew about martial arts mastery, about the relationship between teacher and student, and about the thin line between legend and reality. The witnesses that day would speak in hushed tones for decades to come, their voices trembling as they recounted how they watched two philosophies of combat collide in a dance so beautiful and terrifying that it redefined what it meant to fight. The morning had begun like any other at the Wing Tsun Athletic Association, the scent of incense mingling with the sharp smell of liniment and sweat. Master Ip Man, now in his 70s but moving with the grace of a man half his age, was conducting his regular morning class when the door creaked open. The students, accustomed to visitors and curious onlookers, barely glanced up from their Chisao practice. But when Jackie Chan stepped through that doorway, the entire room fell silent. Chan had been filming in the area, his latest project requiring him to perfect certain Wing Chun techniques that had been eluding him despite months of training with various instructors. His frustration was evident in the tight set of his shoulders, the way his usually animated gestures had become sharp and economical. He had heard whispers, rumors really, about an old master who still taught the pure form of Wing Chun, untainted by the commercialization that had begun to creep into many schools. Sifu, Chan said, his voice carrying the respect due to a master but also an undercurrent of something else, something that made the students exchange glances. I have come to learn. Ip Man studied the younger man for a long moment, his eyes taking in the calloused hands, the way Chan held himself, the subtle signs that spoke of years dedicated to the martial arts. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost conversational, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Learning requires emptying the cup first, Ip Man said, gesturing toward the center of the training floor. Show me what you think you know. What followed was a demonstration that would have left most observers breathless. Chan moved through a series of forms with mechanical precision, his body a symphony of controlled power and athletic grace. Every kick landed exactly where intended, every punch cut through the air with the whistle of displaced molecules. His movements were flawless by any conventional standard, a testament to decades of training and the perfectionism that had made him a global icon. But Ip Man watched with the expression of a man observing a well-rehearsed performance rather than witnessing true martial artistry. When Chan finished, breathing only slightly heavier than when he had begun, the silence in the room was deafening. Beautiful, Ip Man said, and several students nodded in agreement. Like a painting of a tiger, perfect in every detail. He paused, taking a step closer to Chan. But tell me, young man, can a painting hunt? The question hung in the air like smoke from the incense burner in the corner. Chan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and those who knew him well would have recognized the signs of his legendary temper beginning to simmer beneath his carefully controlled exterior. Perhaps the master would like to demonstrate the difference, Chan said, his tone remaining respectful, but carrying an edge that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. Ip Man smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both gentle and utterly predatory. Very well, but first, let me ask you something. When you perform your techniques, what are you thinking about? Chan considered the question seriously, his respect for the older man's reputation keeping his irritation in check. I think about precision, about power, about making each movement perfect. Ah, Ip Man nodded slowly. And that, my friend, is why you fight like you are performing for cameras instead of defending your life. The words hit Chan like a physical blow. His entire career had been built on the marriage of authentic martial arts with cinematic spectacle. And here was one of the acknowledged masters of Wing Chun, suggesting that his approach was fundamentally flawed. "Then teach me," Chan said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Show me what real fighting looks like." What happened next would be debated and analyzed for years to come. Ip Man moved to the center of the training space, his movement so economical that he seemed to barely be moving at all. He gestured for Chan to approach, and when the younger man came within range, everything changed. The first exchange lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Chan threw what appeared to be a perfect straight punch, his form textbook precise, his power evident in the way his entire body moved as one unit. But somehow, impossibly, Ip Man was no longer where the punch was aimed. Instead, Chan found himself stumbling forward, his balance compromised by what felt like the gentlest possible touch to his extended arm. "Again," Ip Man said simply. Chan reset himself, his competitive nature fully engaged now. This time he came in with a combination, a series of techniques that would have overwhelmed most opponents through sheer volume and precision. But Ip Man moved like water around stone, each of Chan's attacks finding nothing but empty air, while Chan himself found his balance constantly shifting, his center of gravity being manipulated by touches so light they were barely perceptible. The students watching began to understand they were witnessing something extraordinary. This was not the explosive athletic combat they had seen in Chan's films, nor was it the rigid, formal sparring they practiced in class. This was something altogether different, something that seemed to operate according to laws of physics that existed in a realm beyond conventional understanding. Chan's frustration mounted with each failed attempt to land a clean technique. His movements became more aggressive, more desperate, as he tried to use his superior strength and speed to overcome whatever mysterious advantage the older man possessed. But it was like trying to fight fog or attempting to punch water itself. "You are fighting yourself," Ip Man observed calmly as Chan paused to catch his breath. "Every technique you throw with the expectation that it will work the way you have practiced it 10,000 times. But what happens when your opponent does not cooperate with your expectations?" The question was rhetorical, but Chan answered anyway, his voice tight with exertion and mounting frustration. "You adapt. Do you?" Ip Man asked. "Or do you simply try the same techniques harder and faster?" The truth of the observation hit Chan like cold water. Looking back over the past several minutes, he realized that he had indeed been doing exactly what Ip Man described. Each time a technique failed, he had responded by attempting it again with more force, more speed, more commitment. He had been fighting like a machine stuck in a loop, unable to process data that contradicted its programming. "I want to learn," Chan said, and this time there was no ego in his voice, no defensive pride, just the honest admission of a student recognizing his limitations. Ip Man's expression softened slightly. "Learning requires unlearning first. You have trained your body to move in ways that are very impressive, very powerful. But you have also trained your mind to think in patterns that limit your ability to respond to the unexpected. True fighting is not about executing perfect techniques. It is about becoming like water, flowing around obstacles, finding the path of least resistance while maintaining the power to carve through stone." What followed was unlike any training session Chan had ever experienced. Instead of learning new techniques, he found himself being systematically deconstructed. Every assumption he had made about timing, about distance, about the relationship between attack and defense was challenged and found wanting. Ip Man would place his hand against Chan's chest and ask him to push forward with all his strength. Chan would comply, his powerful legs driving him forward with enough force to move a small car. But somehow, impossibly, he would find himself moving backward instead. Ip Man's gentle redirection turning his own power against him. "Force against force is the way of the young and foolish," Ip Man explained as Chan struggled to understand what was happening to him. "When you meet hardness with hardness, the stronger wins, but both are damaged. When you meet hardness with softness, the hard breaks itself against the soft, and the soft remains unharmed." The lesson continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Chan found himself being led through a series of exercises that had nothing to do with fighting in any conventional sense. He was asked to feel the tension in his shoulders, to notice how he held his breath when concentrating, to become aware of the subtle ways his body telegraphed his intentions before his conscious mind had even decided what to do. "Your body knows many things your mind has forgotten," Ip Man said as he guided Chan through a slow-motion version of a basic punch. "But your mind insists on controlling everything, and in doing so, it makes everything slower, more predictable, more vulnerable." Chan began to understand that what he was experiencing was not just a different approach to martial arts, but an entirely different way of existing in the world. Where his training had always emphasized the importance of controlling outcomes, of imposing his will through superior technique and conditioning, Ip Man was showing him the power of yielding, of responding rather than initiating, of becoming part of the flow of events rather than trying to dominate them. The breakthrough came suddenly, without warning. Chan was attempting to push past Ip Man's guard when something shifted in his perception. Instead of trying to force his way through, he found himself sensing the subtle changes in the older man's posture, the minute adjustments in weight distribution, the almost invisible signals that preceded each defensive movement. For just a moment, he stopped trying to impose his technique on the situation and instead allowed himself to respond to what was actually happening. His punch landed cleanly on Ip Man's shoulder, not with devastating force, but with the kind of effortless precision that comes from perfect timing rather than superior strength. The impact was light, almost gentle, but it was real contact, the first he had managed in nearly 20 minutes of trying. Ip Man stepped back, a look of genuine surprise crossing his features. Around the room, the students who had been watching in respectful silence began to murmur among themselves. They had seen their master demonstrate his skills countless times, had watched him effortlessly handle challengers who came to test themselves against his reputation, but they had never seen anyone, especially not someone meeting him for the first time, manage to land even the lightest contact during such a demonstration. "Interesting," Ip Man said, and there was something in his tone that made everyone present lean forward slightly. Again. This time the exchange was different. Chan moved with less force but more awareness, his attention focused not on executing perfect techniques, but on reading and responding to the constant flow of information that Ip Man's body language provided. He began to sense the older man's intentions a split second before they manifested as movement, allowing him to position himself in ways that made defense more difficult. The second contact came sooner, a light tap to Ip Man's ribs that the master acknowledged with a slight nod. Then a third, this time to the shoulder again. Each success was minor, barely more than a touch, but they represented something profound. Chan was beginning to fight like a martial artist rather than like a performer. But Ip Man was far from finished with his lesson. As Chan began to gain confidence in this new approach, the older man began to demonstrate why he was considered one of the greatest masters of his generation. His movements became more complex, more layered, as if he was operating on multiple levels simultaneously. Where before he had been simply avoiding Chan's attacks, now he began to create opportunities, to guide the flow of combat in directions that served his purposes. Chan found himself being drawn into exchanges that seemed to favor him initially, but gradually revealed themselves to be elaborate traps. A seemingly successful attack would leave him overextended and vulnerable to a counter that never quite materialized, but left him acutely aware of his exposure. A defensive success would flow seamlessly into a position where his next logical move would place him at a severe disadvantage. It was like playing chess with someone who could see 10 moves ahead while you were still trying to remember how the pieces moved. Every choice Chan made seemed to lead inevitably to a position where Ip Man held all the advantages, where the only options available were increasingly poor ones. "You are beginning to understand," Ip Man said during a brief pause in their exchange. "Fighting is not about techniques, it is about creating and denying opportunities. The master does not win by being stronger or faster. He wins by ensuring that his opponent has no good choices available." Chan wiped sweat from his forehead, his breathing coming harder now, despite the relatively low intensity of their exchange. The mental effort required to operate at this level was more exhausting than any purely physical workout he had ever endured. "But how do you see so far ahead?" Chan asked. How do you know what I'm going to do before I know it myself? Ip Man smiled. I do not predict what you will do. I create situations where you can only do what serves my purposes. Every movement I make is designed to limit your options while expanding my own. By the time you realize what is happening, you have already chosen the path I wanted you to choose. The demonstration that followed was a masterclass in strategic thinking applied to physical combat. Ip Man showed Chan how a seemingly defensive movement could simultaneously set up 3 different offensive possibilities, how a retreat could actually be an advance in disguise, how apparent weakness could mask devastating strength. But more than the technical aspects, Chan began to understand the philosophical framework that made such sophisticated fighting possible. It required a complete abandonment of ego, of the desire to impose one's will through force. Instead, it demanded a kind of intellectual and physical humility, a willingness to work with the forces already in motion rather than trying to dominate them. The water does not fight the stone, Ip Man explained as he demonstrated how to redirect an incoming attack into a throw. But over time, the water shapes the stone into whatever form it chooses. Patience and persistence, combined with perfect understanding of natural principles, can overcome any amount of brute force. As their session continued, Chan began to experience moments of what could only be described as transcendence. There were brief periods where he stopped thinking about fighting and simply responded to the flow of the moment, where his body moved with a fluidity and precision that surprised even him. In those moments, he touched something that went beyond technique, beyond strategy, beyond everything he thought he knew about martial arts. But these moments were fleeting, interrupted by his ingrained habits of thought and movement. Each time he began to relax into this new way of being, his old training would reassert itself, pulling him back into patterns that, while impressive to watch, were ultimately self-defeating against an opponent who understood how to exploit their inherent limitations. This is the hardest part, Ip Man observed, seeming to read Chan's frustration. Unlearning is more difficult than learning. Your body wants to do what it knows how to do well, even when what it knows how to do well is not what the situation requires. The session was approaching its 20th minute when something remarkable happened. Chan, exhausted from the mental effort of trying to think and fight in an entirely new way, simply stopped trying. His mind, overwhelmed by the complexity of what Ip Man was showing him, essentially gave up its attempts to control the situation. In that moment of surrender, something else took over. Chan's body, freed from the constraints of conscious direction, began to move with a naturalness that had been absent from all his previous efforts. His techniques became simpler but more effective. His timing improved dramatically, and for the first time since the session began, he found himself genuinely challenging Ip Man's dominance. The older man's eyes widened slightly as Chan managed to slip past his guard and land a clean technique to his midsection. This one delivered with significant force and perfect timing. It was not a devastating blow, but it was real, undeniable contact that would have had serious consequences in an actual fight. For a moment, both men stood perfectly still, the significance of what had just happened settling over them like dust after an explosion. Around the room, the students who had been watching in fascination began to realize they were witnessing something unprecedented. This was not just a lesson or a demonstration. This was a genuine exchange between masters, each operating at the highest level of their respective abilities. Chan felt something shift inside him, a fundamental change in how he understood the relationship between mind and body, between intention and action. The technique he had just successfully executed had not come from conscious planning or deliberate application of learned principles. It had emerged spontaneously from a state of relaxed awareness that he had never experienced before. Now you begin to understand, Ip Man said, and there was something in his voice that had not been there before. Respect, recognition, the acknowledgement of one master speaking to another. But the lesson was not over. If anything, Ip Man's intensity increased as he realized that Chan was finally ready to receive the deeper teachings. What followed was an exchange of such complexity and sophistication that the students watching could barely follow the movements, let alone understand the principles being demonstrated. Chan found himself drawn into a dance of attack and defense that operated according to rules he was only beginning to grasp. Every movement had multiple purposes. Every technique contained within it the seeds of several others. The line between offense and defense became meaningless as each exchange flowed seamlessly from one phase to another. But most remarkably, Chan began to hold his own. Not through superior strength or speed, but through the application of principles that he was learning and integrating in real time. His movements became more economical, more purposeful, as he began to understand how to use Ip Man's own energy against him. The 22nd minute arrived with both men locked in an exchange that neither could clearly dominate. Chan, operating from this new state of relaxed awareness, was matching Ip Man technique for technique, principle for principle. Where the session had begun with the older man effortlessly controlling every aspect of their interaction, it had evolved into a genuine contest between equals. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the exchange stopped. Both men stepped back simultaneously, breathing hard but neither showing any signs of defeat or dominance. They stood facing each other across the worn wooden floor, master and student, teacher and pupil, but also something more. Ip Man was the first to speak, his voice carrying a note of wonder that surprised everyone present, including himself. "Now we are equal," he said simply. The words hung in the air like a benediction, transforming everything that had come before. This was not the condescending praise of a teacher acknowledging a student's progress. This was the recognition of one master acknowledging another, the admission that the gap between them had closed in ways that went far beyond the merely technical. Chan stood perfectly still, trying to process what had just happened to him. In 22 minutes, his entire understanding of martial arts, of fighting, of the relationship between mind and body, had been completely reconstructed. He had entered the training hall as a skilled performer of martial techniques and emerged as something altogether different. "But how?" Chan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did I change so quickly?" Ip Man smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features into something almost boyish. "You did not change. You simply stopped preventing yourself from being who you already were. All the knowledge, all the ability, it was already within you. You had simply trained yourself to ignore it in favor of what you thought you should be doing." The profundity of the observation struck Chan like a physical blow. Everything he had achieved in his career, all the recognition and success, had been built on a foundation of fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of mastery itself. He had been trying to perfect his ability to impose his will on the world through superior technique and conditioning, when true mastery lay in learning to harmonize with the forces already in motion. "This is why so few ever reach the highest levels," Ip Man continued, beginning to move slowly around the training space as if the exchange had energized rather than exhausted him. "They become trapped by their own success. The better they become at doing things the wrong way, the harder it becomes to learn the right way." Chan understood. His very expertise had become an obstacle to deeper learning. Every technique he had mastered, every principle he had internalized, had created neural pathways that made it increasingly difficult to approach combat from a fundamentally different perspective. "But you," Ip Man said, stopping directly in front of Chan and looking into his eyes with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "You were ready to let go. When the moment came, when your mind finally admitted defeat, you were willing to surrender control to something deeper, something that your years of training had prepared but never allowed to emerge." The students who had witnessed the exchange began to understand that they had seen something that would likely never be repeated. This was not just a lesson or a demonstration, but a kind of initiation, a transmission of understanding that went far beyond anything that could be taught through conventional instruction. Chan bowed deeply to Ip Man, the gesture carrying more genuine respect than any of the formal courtesies he had offered earlier. When he straightened, there was something different in his bearing, a quality of centeredness and awareness that had not been there before. "Sifu," he said, and the word carried a weight and meaning that it had lacked in his earlier attempts at respectful address. "What happens now?" Ip Man considered the question seriously. "Now you begin the real work. What you experienced today was a glimpse, a moment of understanding that showed you what is possible. But moments pass. The challenge is learning to return to that state at will, to make it your natural way of being rather than a lucky accident. He gestured toward the other students who had been watching the entire exchange with expressions of awe and confusion. These young people have been training with me for years, practicing the same forms, drilling the same techniques. But until they are ready to let go of their attachment to being right, to being in control, they cannot access what you touch today. Chan looked around the room, seeing the students with new eyes. They were all technically proficient, all dedicated practitioners who had invested countless hours in perfecting their art. But there was something in their movements, something in the way they held themselves, that spoke of the same fundamental limitation he had carried into the training hall that morning. "How long does it take?" Chan asked. "To make this permanent?" Ip Man laughed, a sound of genuine amusement that seemed to lighten the entire atmosphere of the room. "That is like asking how long it takes to become wise, or how long it takes to understand love. There is no schedule, no curriculum that can guarantee results. Some people touch this understanding once and spend the rest of their lives trying to recapture it. Others integrate it so completely that they forget they ever fought any other way." The implications of what Ip Man was saying began to settle over Chan like a weight. He had experienced something profound, something that had fundamentally altered his understanding of what was possible. But experience and mastery were very different things. The real work was just beginning. "Will you teach me?" Chan asked, and there was no pride in the question, no attempt to negotiate terms or conditions. Just the simple request of a student who had recognized his need for guidance. Ip Man studied him for a long moment, his eyes seeming to look not just at Chan but into him, evaluating something that went far deeper than technical ability or even natural talent. "I will teach you what can be taught," he finally said. "But understand this, what happened here today cannot be replicated through instruction. It can only be rediscovered through your own sincere practice, your own willingness to let go of everything you think you know about fighting, about control, about winning and losing." The training session had officially ended, but its implications would ripple outward for years to come. Chan left the training hall that day, carrying with him not just new techniques or strategies, but an entirely new understanding of what it meant to be a martial artist. The experience would influence every film he made afterward, every fight scene he choreographed, every student he would eventually teach. But more than that, it had given him a glimpse of something that went beyond martial arts entirely. In those moments when his conscious mind had stepped aside and allowed something deeper to take control, he had touched a way of being in the world that was more responsive, more fluid, more genuinely powerful than anything he had previously imagined possible. Years later, when interviewers would ask him about that day, about what it felt like to train with one of the legendary masters of Wing Chun, Chan would struggle to find words adequate to describe the experience. How do you explain the feeling of having your entire worldview reconstructed in the space of 22 minutes? How do you convey the profound humility that comes from realizing that everything you thought you knew was just the beginning of real understanding? "He showed me that true mastery is not about perfecting techniques," Chan would eventually say in interviews, his voice taking on a quality of reverence that surprised those who knew him primarily as an entertainer. "It is about perfecting your relationship with uncertainty, with the unknown, with forces larger than your individual will." The lesson that Ip Man had taught him that day went far beyond the purely martial. It was a lesson about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, between skill and mastery, between fighting and what the old masters called the way. It was a lesson that would influence not just how Chan approached combat, but how he approached life itself. In the end, the most profound realization was perhaps the simplest one. That true strength comes not from the ability to impose your will on the world, but from the wisdom to harmonize with forces that are already in motion, to become part of the flow rather than fighting against it. It was a lesson that could only be learned through direct experience, and once learned, could never be forgotten. The fluorescent lights continued to hum overhead as the two men parted ways that day, teacher and student, master and master, each carrying with them the memory of an exchange that had transcended the boundaries of ordinary instruction. In 22 minutes, everything had changed, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. Jackie Chan was on live TV. Muhammad Ali Said. Jackie Chan would whoop me. 50 million couldn't believe. The studio lights blazed down mercilessly as Muhammad Ali shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the air conditioning humming overhead. It was March 15th, 1978, and the most famous boxer in the world was about to say something that would shock 50 million viewers watching live television. Something that would make headlines around the globe and change how the world viewed martial arts forever. The smell of hot television equipment mixed with the nervous energy of the production crew as they prepared for what was supposed to be a routine interview on Wide World of Sports. Ali had done hundreds of these appearances, charming audiences with his quick wit and larger-than-life personality. But tonight felt different. Tonight, there was an electricity in the air that no one could quite explain. Across the country in Los Angeles, a young stuntman named Jackie Chan was finishing up another grueling day on a movie set, his body aching from the countless takes required to perfect a single fight sequence. The 24-year-old had been working in Hollywood for barely 2 years, still struggling to make Americans understand that what he did wasn't just mindless violence, but an art form that required the precision of a surgeon and the creativity of a poet. Jackie wiped the fake blood from his knuckles and glanced at his watch. 8:30 p.m. He had just enough time to grab dinner and catch the Ali interview that everyone had been talking about. The greatest was always good for entertainment, and Jackie needed something to take his mind off the rejection he'd faced that morning when another studio executive told him his English wasn't good enough, his fighting style too foreign, his dreams too big for a Chinese kid in America. Back in the New York studio, host Howard Cosell adjusted his thick-rimmed glasses and reviewed his notes one final time. The veteran broadcaster had interviewed presidents and kings, but there was something uniquely magnetic about Ali that made even seasoned professionals nervous. The man didn't just answer questions, he performed, he philosophized, he turned every conversation into a theatrical masterpiece. 30 seconds to air, called out the floor director, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the studio. Camera operators made final adjustments while sound technicians monitored their equipment with the intensity of air traffic controllers. This was live television at its most dangerous and exciting, where anything could happen and 50 million people would witness it in real time. Ali loosened his shoulders and flashed that famous smile, but those who knew him well could see the fatigue behind his eyes. The years of punishment in the ring were beginning to show, and whispers about his slowing reflexes had started to circulate among boxing insiders. At 36, he was still the heavyweight champion, but Father Time remained undefeated, and Ali knew it better than anyone. 10 seconds, the floor director announced, holding up his fingers as he counted down. The red light on camera 1 illuminated like a warning beacon, and suddenly the entire country was watching. Good evening, I'm Howard Cosell, and welcome to a very special edition of Wide World of Sports. Cosell began in his distinctive nasal tone. Tonight, we're joined by the one and only Muhammad Ali, 3-time heavyweight champion of the world, and quite simply the most recognizable athlete on the planet. Ali leaned back in his chair, that trademark grin spreading across his face. Howard, you know I'm not just the most recognizable athlete. I'm the most recognizable person. Period. When I go to China, they know Muhammad Ali. When I go to Africa, they know Muhammad Ali. I'm more famous than the president. Cosell chuckled, knowing that with Ali, the line between confidence and comedy was often razor thin. Speaking of China, Muhammad, there's been quite a bit of talk lately about martial arts, particularly with all these kung fu movies coming out of Hong Kong. What do you make of all this? For a moment, Ali's expression grew serious, and he stroked his chin thoughtfully. This wasn't the question he'd expected, but it was one he'd been thinking about more and more lately. You know, Howard, people think because I'm the heavyweight champion, because I can float like a butterfly and sting like a bee, that I can beat anybody in any kind of fighting. But I'll tell you something that might surprise folks. The studio fell silent, except for the low hum of equipment. Even the camera operator seemed to lean in slightly, sensing that something significant was about to happen. I've been watching these martial arts films, studying them like I study fight footage of my opponents. Ali continued, his voice taking on a more contemplative tone than his usual bombastic delivery. And there's this young man, Chinese fellow, name of Jackie Chan. I saw him in a picture called Snake in the Eagle's Shadow. And let me tell you something, Howard. That boy moves like nothing I've ever seen." In his small Los Angeles apartment, Jackie nearly choked on his instant noodles. He'd been half watching the interview while eating dinner, but now Ali had his complete attention. The greatest boxer who ever lived was talking about him on national television. Back in the studio, Cosell raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying this Jackie Chan could present a challenge to the heavyweight champion of the world?" Ali was quiet for a long moment, longer than anyone who knew him had ever seen him pause during an interview. When he finally spoke, his words would echo around the world for decades to come. "Howard, I'm gonna tell you something, and I want everybody watching to understand I'm being completely serious here. If I had to fight Jackie Chan under his rules, with all that kicking and jumping and spinning, that boy would whoop me. He'd whoop me good." The silence that followed was deafening. 50 million viewers sat stunned in their living rooms. In the studio, you could hear a pin drop. Howard Cosell, the man who had never been at a loss for words, found himself speechless for perhaps the first time in his career. Ali continued, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his theme. "See, people don't understand what real martial arts is about. They think it's all chopping boards and breaking bricks, but what Jackie Chan does, that's pure artistry combined with devastating effectiveness. The boy can fight from any angle, any position. He can use his feet, his hands, his whole body as a weapon. In a boxing ring, sure, I'd have the advantage because those are my rules. But if we fought his way, I wouldn't last 2 minutes." The camera zoomed in on Ali's face, capturing every nuance of his expression. This wasn't the showboating, the poetry, the theatrical bravado that audiences expected. This was raw honesty from a man who had never backed down from anyone or anything. "You really believe that?" Cosell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Howard, let me paint you a picture," Ali said, leaning forward in his chair. "I'm 6'3", 215 pounds of muscle and speed. I've got a reach advantage over almost every man alive, and I can throw a punch faster than most people can blink. But Jackie Chan, he's like fighting water. You can't hit water, Howard. It flows around you, it adapts, it finds every weakness and exploits it." In Los Angeles, Jackie set down his chopsticks with trembling hands. His English wasn't perfect, but he understood every word Ali was saying. The man who had defeated Sonny Liston, Joe Frazier, and George Foreman was telling the world that a struggling stuntman from Hong Kong could beat him in a fight. "I've studied his movements," Ali continued, his voice taking on an almost reverential quality. "The way he uses his environment, turns everyday objects into weapons, the way he can fight 3 or 4 men at once and make it look like a dance. That's not just fighting, that's genius-level strategy combined with physical ability that borders on the supernatural." The phone lines at the television studio were lighting up like Christmas trees. Viewers from coast to coast were calling in, some outraged that Ali would dare suggest anyone could beat him, others fascinated by this unexpected insight into the mind of the champion. Cosell, finally finding his voice again, pressed forward. "Muhammad, you faced some of the most dangerous men who ever lived. Surely you're not seriously suggesting that an actor essentially could pose a real threat to you?" Ali's eyes flashed with something between amusement and annoyance. "Actor? Howard, you're missing the point entirely. Jackie Chan isn't just an actor any more than I'm just a boxer. We're both artists, but our canvas is combat. The difference is his art form has been perfected over thousands of years. Boxing, as great as it is maybe 200 years old as a formal sport." The champion stood up suddenly, startling everyone in the studio. "Let me show you something," he said, moving to an open area near his chair. "This is how I throw my famous right hand." He demonstrated with a quick, sharp movement that cut through the air like a whip. Fast, powerful, devastating when it connects. "But look at this." Ali then attempted to mimic some of the movements he'd seen Jackie perform, his long limbs moving in unfamiliar patterns. Even his awkward approximation of kung fu techniques had a certain grace to it, but it was clear he was operating far outside his comfort zone. "You see?" he said, slightly out of breath as he returned to his seat. I'm trying to copy maybe 1% of what Jackie Chan can do, and I'm already tired. That boy has trained his entire life in fighting systems that use every part of the human body, every angle of attack, every possible defensive position. It's like comparing a sword to a Swiss Army knife. The sword is beautiful and deadly, but the Swiss Army knife can do 100 different things. In his apartment, Jackie felt tears welling up in his eyes. For 2 years, he'd been told he wasn't good enough, wasn't American enough, wasn't commercial enough. Directors saw him as just another martial arts novelty act, a temporary fad that would fade when audiences got bored with kung fu movies. But here was Muhammad Ali, the most famous athlete in the world, describing his work as art, as genius, as something worthy of respect and admiration. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with Ali elaborating on his philosophy of combat and his growing appreciation for martial arts. He spoke about the discipline required, the mental toughness, the years of training that went into developing the kind of skills Jackie possessed. People think fighting is just about being tough, about being able to take punishment and dish it out, Ali explained. But real fighting, the kind of fighting Jackie Chan represents, is about intelligence. It's about using your opponent's strength against him, about finding solutions to problems in real time, about turning disadvantages into advantages. When Cosell asked about the possibility of actually meeting Jackie Chan, Ali's face lit up like a child's on Christmas morning. Nothing would make me happier than to sit down with that young man and learn from him. I may be the heavyweight champion, but I'm always a student first. And from what I've seen, Jackie Chan could teach me things about fighting that would revolutionize how I think about the sport. The interview concluded with Ali issuing an open invitation for Jackie to visit him whenever he was on the East Coast. I want to shake the hand of someone who's taken martial arts to a level I never thought possible, he said as the credits began to roll. As the red light on the camera faded, the studio erupted in chatter. Producers huddled in corners, already planning follow-up segments. Camera operators and sound technicians discussed what they'd just witnessed. Everyone knew they'd been part of something special, something that would be talked about for years to come. But the real impact was just beginning. Within hours, clips of Ali's comments were being played on news programs across the country. Newspapers scrambled to get quotes from martial arts experts, boxing analysts, and anyone who could provide context for the champion's shocking admission. In Hong Kong, where it was already the next morning, film producers who had never heard of Jackie Chan were suddenly very interested in the young man who had impressed Muhammad Ali. Phone calls were made, meetings were scheduled, and contracts that had been gathering dust were suddenly pulled from filing cabinets and reviewed with fresh eyes. Back in Los Angeles, Jackie sat in his apartment long after the interview had ended, staring at the phone. Part of him wanted to call someone, anyone, to share this incredible moment. But who would believe him? Who would understand what it meant to have your hero, someone you'd watched and admired from afar, speak about you with such respect and admiration? The next morning, Jackie's phone began ringing before dawn. His agent, who had been struggling to get him work for months, was suddenly fielding calls from studios, producers, and directors who wanted to meet the martial artist who had earned Muhammad Ali's respect. Offers that had been rejected just days before were suddenly back on the table with better terms and more money. But the real change wasn't in the business opportunities. It was in how Jackie saw himself and his art. For years, he'd been trying to fit into Hollywood's narrow vision of what a martial artist should be. He'd been told to be more like Bruce Lee, to be more aggressive, more intimidating, more traditionally masculine. But Ali's words had validated something Jackie had always believed but had been afraid to express, that martial arts could be joyful, creative, even funny without losing its power or effectiveness. 3 weeks after the interview, Jackie found himself on a plane to New York, having accepted Ali's invitation to meet in person. The flight gave him time to think about what he wanted to say to the man who had changed his life with a few words on television. When they finally met at Ali's training camp in Pennsylvania, the encounter was everything Jackie had hoped it would be, and more. Ali was exactly as warm and generous in person as he had seemed on television, and he spent hours asking Jackie about his training, his philosophy, and his approach to fighting. "You know what impressed me most about your movies?" Ali asked as they sat in his private gym, surrounded by heavy bags and training equipment. It wasn't just the physical skills, though those are incredible. It was the intelligence behind every move. You don't just fight, you solve problems. Every opponent presents a different puzzle, and you find creative ways to solve each one. Jackie, still struggling with his English but determined to communicate clearly, replied, "In Chinese martial arts, we say the best fighter is one who wins without fighting. But when you must fight, you must be like water. Water always finds a way." Ali nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what I saw in your films. You turn fighting into something beautiful, something that teaches as well as entertains. That's what real art does. It makes people think differently about the world." They spent the afternoon training together, with Jackie showing Ali some basic kung fu techniques and Ali demonstrating the footwork and hand speed that had made him champion. It was an unlikely friendship between two men from completely different worlds, but they shared something fundamental: a deep respect for their crafts and an understanding that true mastery comes from years of dedicated practice and constant learning. As Jackie prepared to leave that evening, Ali pulled him aside for a private conversation. "I want you to remember something," the champion said, his voice serious but kind. "What I said on television, I meant every word. But more than that, I want you to understand that you represent something important. You're showing the world that strength doesn't have to look like what people expect. You're proving that someone can be powerful and gentle, tough and funny, traditional and innovative all at the same time." Those words would stay with Jackie for the rest of his career. Years later, when he became one of the biggest movie stars in the world, when his films grossed billions of dollars and made him a global icon, he would often think back to that television interview and the validation it provided at a crucial moment in his life. The impact of Ali's comments extended far beyond Jackie's personal career. In the months following the interview, American audiences began to view martial arts films with new eyes. What had once been dismissed as mindless action became appreciated as sophisticated choreography. Martial arts schools across the country reported increased enrollment as people sought to understand what Ali had seen in Jackie's techniques. The interview also marked a turning point in how combat sports were perceived and discussed. Ali's willingness to acknowledge that his skills, as impressive as they were, had limitations opened up conversations about different fighting philosophies and the evolution of martial arts. It planted seeds that would eventually grow into the mixed martial arts revolution that would transform combat sports decades later. But perhaps the most important lesson from that March evening in 1978 was about the power of recognition and respect. Muhammad Ali, at the height of his fame and success, took time to acknowledge the artistry and skill of someone most Americans had never heard of. He used his platform not to build himself up, but to shine a light on talent that deserved recognition. In doing so, Ali demonstrated something that would become a hallmark of true greatness: the security and confidence to praise others without feeling diminished. He showed that real champions lift others up rather than tearing them down, that strength is demonstrated not just in victory over opponents, but in the grace to acknowledge excellence wherever it appears. Jackie Chan would go on to become one of the most beloved entertainers in the world, known for his incredible stunts, his innovative fight choreography, and his infectious sense of humor. But he never forgot the moment when Muhammad Ali looked into a television camera and told 50 million people that the young Chinese stuntman was worthy of respect and admiration. Years later, when interviewers would ask Jackie about the most important moment in his career, he would often mention that television interview. Not because it led to better roles or more money, though it certainly helped with both, but because it came at a time when he was beginning to doubt himself and his place in the entertainment world. "Muhammad Ali taught me that being different is not weakness," Jackie would say in interviews. "He showed me that you can respect your opponents while still being confident in your own abilities. Most importantly, he proved that true champions recognize greatness in others, even when it comes in unexpected forms." The lesson extends beyond martial arts or entertainment. In a world that often seems divided by differences in culture, background, and approach, Ali's words that night demonstrated the power of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize genuine skill and artistry. He saw past the language barrier, the cultural differences, and the unfamiliarity of Kung Fu to appreciate the dedication, creativity, and mastery that Jackie represented. That recognition changed not just Jackie's life, but the lives of countless martial artists who suddenly found their art form taken seriously by mainstream audiences. It opened doors for Asian performers in Hollywood and helped bridge cultural gaps that had seemed insurmountable just years before. The ripple effects continue to this day. Every time an athlete from one sport acknowledges the skills of someone from a different discipline, every time an established star uses their platform to highlight emerging talent, every time someone in a position of influence chooses recognition over rivalry, they echo the spirit of what Muhammad Ali did on that March evening in 1978. In the end, the most lasting impact of Ali's words may not have been on Jackie Chan's career or on the martial arts film industry, but on how we think about greatness itself. True champions, Ali showed us, are secure enough in their own abilities to celebrate excellence wherever they find it. They understand that acknowledging someone else's talent doesn't diminish their own, but rather demonstrates the depth of their understanding and the breadth of their appreciation for human achievement. When Muhammad Ali told the world that Jackie Chan would whoop him, he wasn't diminishing his own legendary status. He was expanding it, showing that greatness isn't just about what you can do, but about what you can recognize, appreciate, and celebrate in others. That may be the most important lesson of all, and the one that ensures both men's legacies will endure long after their final bow.